I'll be very brief. I think I said at the beginning that it was important to note that we were debating these issues within a sort of relatively, narrow range and a certain amount of consensus, and I think that's been manifest tonight. So I think it's useful to stress that in many ways the roots of our disagreements here have to do with, I'd say, varying views from deeply skeptical to moderately skeptical to considerably less skeptical about the capacity of government to intervene effectively in economic arrangements and pursuit of justice, social order, and so on. And that, I think that skepticism, more than the deepest sort of philosophical division about sort of the purpose of government, period, and so on, is what defines our disagreement. I think I've sort of invoked a person to Bill's left a couple times throughout the evening, and I think it is worth stressing that in terms of American politics, there are views certainly further to our left, and possibly, I don't want to impose, but possibly further to the right, that are both not represented here, but also do sort of shape the way this is debated. That a lot of the passion around inequality on the left comes from a place that speaks to Bill's point about justice, but has, I think, a stronger view of how unjust, inequitable distributions of wealth are. And then on the right, I think there is a sort of more deeply libertarian, sort of Ayn Rand influenced view that sees government intervention for the sake of economic justice as more simply sort of warped and inherently destructive, not just impractical. And I think that dispute hasn't been a big part of our conversation here tonight, which is why we've sort of found a lot of common ground. But I think it's an important thing to keep in mind in thinking about how this debate plays out in actual American elections.
Michael?
Very much along the same lines. I'd add that I'm not in the Randian camp at all.
I didn't think so.
No.
I didn't mean.
Yeah. The way I would look at it is that there are very, very few sort of policy choices that you will ever have that make everybody better off. Somebody's always a loser, and the way you want to handle this is sort of adopt the sort of efficient policies or the sensible policies that sort of make the pie bigger, and treat the distribution question as separate, but make sure it gets addressed. And so the classical example everyone has for that is sort of free trade, right? It's good for everybody, or for almost everybody. I mean, in the aggregate, it's very, very good. Are there losers? Yes, there are losers. And if somebody proposes to compensate or make them whole for a policy that on the whole benefits the country, I'm all in favor of that. But I come back to show me that that is actually what you're doing, and it's not just another policy bauble. And I'll add one more thing. I mean, the more you try to deal with sort of a syndrome of problems under a single umbrella heading called inequality, because that's shorthand for what bothers a lot of people, the more you set yourself up or set the country up for failure, because it just becomes such an unwieldy thing that it can't be handled anymore, at all anymore. And I think the way forward, if there is one, is to focus on making the institutions that we have actually work for a change, as opposed to sort of reinventing the wheel. And again, nobody liked clean air as a luxury good. I'll give you another one. Free college for everybody. Are you kidding me? We can't afford it. There are lots of people who shouldn't be in college. trade schools that this came
Present
up during,
company accepted.
half of you shouldn't be here.
Just to know you can figure out which
That's
half.
dean, right.
It came up during a conversation outside. I thought it was just too good to miss. Right? So, and I think there are actually, if you put sort of ideological distractions aside, there are quite a few things that we could be doing that will be useful. And I think if we sat around here for another 25 minutes, we could come up with a list of 15 things.
Bill?
Well, in his opening remarks, Ross made an interesting observation about the Clinton years, which had the additional merit of truth, to quote Henry Kissinger. And, namely, that there were gains across the board, but if you looked at this famous Gini coefficient, it rose. Nobody cared. And they didn't care for a very simple reason. The growth was being widely shared. People had a sense not only of moving forward, but that it was fair, or fair enough, that they weren't being left with nothing, while some very fortunate people were making off with everything. And so I want to take that as a jumping off point to return to where I started. And that is, the fundamental problem, it seems to me, is not so much inequality as it is stagnation. What's wrong with stagnation? Well, if you're not doing any better, if you're working harder and harder just to keep your nose across above the waterline, while others are doing very, very well, that is a troubling experience when you're stuck. It can lead to resignation. It can lead to rage. Each, it seems to me, is pathological, politically speaking. But more than that, and this is what worries me the most, think about the American dream, right, which is as close to the heart of our culture as anything can be. And the gist of it is that if you work hard, stay out of trouble, do what you're supposed to do as a worker, as a parent, as a spouse, as a member of society, you're not going to get rich, but you'll do a little better over time than you did before, and your children will do better still. In that sense, the American dream is progressive, small p to its core. And nothing could be a more fundamental shock to the American political system than the creeping realization that maybe the American dream, as I've just defined it, is no longer feasible, no longer attainable. That is, it seems to me, a very, very dangerous perception and an even more dangerous reality. So I worry a lot, not that there is the immiseration of the poor and the working class, Ross is absolutely right about that, but that there has been a fundamental interruption in assumptions and expectations about what life in this country is all about. If there's anything that we can do to restore that sense of hope and merit-based progress towards better lives for ourselves and our children, it seems to me we ought to take those possible policy responses very seriously. I think the risks are more on the side of not trying than they are of trying and failing. I don't know whether that's optimism or just my assessment of the balance of risks, but that's where I am.
Thanks.
So let me open it up now. First, especially to students, any questions you might have about any aspects of the topic or the debate tonight?